This is Gemara in Gittin Daf Chaf Beis, and we're only on Chaf Aleph Amid Beis. We are 3 lines from the bottom as we're in the middle of discussing different items that you could write the get on. We were discussing at the end of this year the first part of the Mishnah, which is writing a get on something that is mechubar, detaching it, and what the status with that is. And now we're continuing to writing the get on similar entities. Says the Gemara, Kasfu al cheres shel otzitz nakav. We have a flower pot with a hole. We know that the din of a flower pot with the hole is considered to be yoinik. It's considered to be nourishing itself from the ground. So you wrote the get on the cheres, on the flower pot itself of a whole flower pot which is considered attached to the ground. A kosher, the halacha is it's kosher. You take the whole flower pot and you give her the whole flower pot. And the chiddush over here is this is not considered mechusar ketzitza. It's not considered like we learned at the top of the Amud that there's an event that you actually have to do. Because even though halacha, it's considered attached to the ground, because l'maisa you can just give the whole flower pot and there is no problem. Continues the Braisa al Eloshal Zayis. If you wrote it on the leaf of a Zayis, of a olive Nakov, which is, I read that completely incorrectly. One more time. Al Eloshal Zayis, Al Eloshal Otzitz Nakov. You wrote it on the leaf of a whole flower pot. Abaya Amar Kosher, V'Rava Amar Pasal. In this case, if you wrote it on the actual plant, then we have a machlekes. Now the Gemara explains what's the machlekes. Abaya Amar kosher. Why is it kosher? Again, the shakalev yavle, because you could give the entire flower pot. There's no problem. Rav Amar Basal. Here it is. Gezeira shema yiktaim. We're afraid you're going to come to actually cut off the leaf. This leaf is considered to be attached to the ground. We're afraid you're actually going to cut off the leaf. Then we have an issue like we learned on the top of Amud Beis yesterday, that there's an event that's splitting between the writing and giving of the get. It's considered mechubar, and that's the reason why it's not going to be good. That is the opinion of Rava. So machlekes and Baya and Rava, exactly what is the story over here? Continues the Gemara, 2 dots, Chav Beis Amid Aleph. Now, once we're on the topic of a whole flower pot, we sort of take a little bit of a left turn. If I have a flower pot that's owned by one person, and I have the flowers, the vegetation owned by someone else. So the flower pot owner sold his flower pot to the owner of the vegetation inside the flower pot. What's halacha? To do a kinyan on the flower pot itself, you do meshicha, which is of course the way you make a kinyan on all metaltalin, on all movable items. And then the halacha is that you're kana. But continues the Braisa, what about the flip side case? What if the one who owns the flowers sells his vegetation to the owner of the flower pot? So that was a little bit confusing, because whenever he moves the flower pot, he's moving his own item. Happens to be that there's vegetation inside. In this case, till you do an actual kinyan in the vegetation, because by doing a kinyan in the pot, you're not doing anything. Continues the Braisa with another case. Otis uzraim shalechod. Now let's say you have a flower pot and vegetation of one person. And you sold both of them to a second person. Hechsik bizraim. So if you made a chazaka in the vegetation, kana otis, then you'll by default be kind of the otis. Why? Interesting din, says the Gemara. Zui sheshaninu nechasim she'ein lem achrayis. Items without a chrayis, which is usually called movable items, which in this case will be the pot, that's a movable item, is acquired in the chasim sheyesh lam achrayis. Is acquired together with something with a chrayis. The vegetation reviewing like karka, like land, it's something that is considered at some level, the Gemara explains, as if it has a chrayis, and therefore you could be kind of the pot with the kinyan on the vegetation, because that's as if you're being kind of the metaltalin together with the karka, with the land. The chaz of achrayis, because of shara b'chazaka. Another case, the third case of the Brisa. Hechzik ba'atzitz. Let's say he made a chazaka on the flower pot in this case where the guy tried to sell it to him. Af atzitz like kana. You're not even kind of the atzitz. Why are you not kind of the atzitz? So Rashi here points out in the second narrow line, because a chazaka is not a kinyan on movable items. Meshicha, drawing the item, is a kinyan on movable items. So if you did the wrong kinyan, this is really Baba Basar raid. If you did a chazaka, which is the way to be kind of karka, but you did that on movable items, that doesn't do anything for you. Like an until what? Sheyachsub Gizraim, you did actual chazaka on the vegetation, which is called karka. Nakvu ba'aretz. And we have another case, and again, this is all really, derech agav, a bit random. Once we're on the topic of a whole flower pot and how you would give it as a get, we take a left turn, we discuss some other dinim. So we're 10 lines down. The first line is nakvoi ba'aretz. If there's a hole and nakvoi ba'aretz v'noivai b'chutz la'aretz. So the plant is sitting in Eretz Yisrael and there's a hole in the pot, and now so it's getting the nutrition from Eretz Yisrael, but the noifai, the branches are growing outward into Chutz La'aretz. So does this plant, is this called an Eretz Yisrael dika plant? Because the mice it's sitting in Eretz Yisrael, receiving nourishment through the holes from Eretz Yisrael, so it has meiser, shvius, etc. Or is it considered Chutz La'aretz because the mice it's growing over into Chutz La'aretz? Says the Gemara, Abaya Amar Basar Nakvay Azinan, Rav Amar Basar Noifa Azinan. We have a machlekes. Abaya says you go after where it's noiki, you go after the holes, you go after the nourishment. And Rav says you go after the branches as linon. So explains the Gemara what exactly is going on over here. If through these holes there's actual roots growing into the ground of Eretz Yisrael, then there's no machlekes. Everyone agrees that avada is actually considered an Eretz Yisrael like a plant. That's not a shayla. Ki pligi, what's the machlekes? B'deloi ashrish, doesn't have roots. And that's where Rava says it goes after the leaves, and Abaya says it still goes after the nourishment, and of course the nourishment is still from Eretz Yisrael because there's holes in the flower pot. Says more really. There's no machlekes if it has roots. We have two gardens, one on top of another is a slant, and there's two gardens, one on top of the other. Time is vegetation in the middle. Rameir Aimer, who owns this vegetation, shall all you goes to the top guy, Aimer shall dachlin goes to the bottom guy. So what do we see? We see even though the roots are in the, Rashi explains, the top guy's rishos, still Rav Yehuda holds it goes after the bottom guy's rishos because that's where the branches are hanging over. Says the Gemara, Hasam Kiritani, time over there we explained, Amar Ameir Mam here to Elyon Nitalas Afroi. There it's a separate machlekes they're arguing about. Because Rameir holds if the top guy takes away his dirt, Ein Kan Yarek, there's no vegetation because it's in the dirt of the top guy. And Amar Rav Yehuda, why does Rav Yehuda argue? He argues for a different reason. He says, Mam here to Tachtin, Lamali says Kan Osai. Afar, if the bottom guy fills up his garden with earth, again we're on a slant. So here's the vegetation. It's in the top guy. So the top guy takes away his stuff, there's no vegetation. If the bottom guy fills up his stuff with dirt, then as well there's no vegetation. Ein kan yarek. So that's why over there it's a separate machlekes, says the Gemara, and that doesn't factor into our case of whether there really is a machlekes, whether when the item will be rooted in Eretz Yisrael. Continues the Gemara doesn't let up. Really, there's no machlekes when it's rooted in Eretz Yisrael. Vatani, we learned in a different brayso. We're about 20 lines for the end of the Amud. The first one line is lo pligi. Elon, we have a tree, miksasei ba'aretz. Part of the trees in Eretz Yisrael, miksasei b'chutz la'aretz. What's the halacha? Tevel v'chulin muravin zeh b'zeh divrei Rebbe. Rebbe hold this tree is messed up. Tevel is from Eretz Yisrael. Chulin is from Chutz La'aretz. The tree is part here and part there. Everything is confused. We'll see what the case is in a moment. Rashba goimer, no. Hagadol b'chiyav chayiv, that which grows in Eretz Yisrael is chayiv. Hagadol b'ptur, p'tur. So my love, the Gemara thinks right now, mixas noifai ba'aretz. We think that part of the branches are in Eretz Yisrael. Or mixas noifai b'chutz la'aretz. A part of the branches are in chutz la'aretz. But the hashrasha, but the roots are in one area. And even though the roots are in one area, we have a machlekes. So we see that even when the roots are in Eretz Yisrael, we still have a machlekes. Says the Gemara, no, that is not the case. Mixas shirashin ba'aretz u'mixas sharashim b'chutz la'aretz. You know what the case is? That the roots themselves cross over the boundaries, part in Eretz Yisrael and part in the Chutz La'aretz. So my time of the Rashbag. So why does Rav Shimon Gamliel say it goes where it grows if the roots are on both sides? Because it's an interesting case. The mafsik sunma, you have roots going on both sides, Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. There's a rock, a sunma that separates it in the middle. So Rav Shimon Gamliel says the part that comes from here is from here, apart from there is in there. My time of the Rebbe. And why does Rebbe hold that it's all mixed up? Dalji Arvi, because afterwards is a rock in the middle, gets nourished on both sides, and then it gets mixed in the top. So B'maika Mifski says the Gemara, Mar Savar Aviyah Meval, Velumar Samar Eiluchudei, Vailuchudei. Rebbe holds that the fact that it's in the airspace of both Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz, it's Mevalvel, it mixes it up, and that's the reason why Rebbe holds that you have Chulin and Tavel, Muravin Zelizeh. Whereas Hashem Gamliel says no, but the Gemara proves emphatically that this is not proving that B'da Ashrish, when it's rooted, it's a machlekes. So we stick with that which we said, that if the roots are in Eretz Yisrael, everyone agrees it goes after Eretz Yisrael, and that won't be a machlekes in our case. And we continue, Rav Yehuda ben Beseira Imer, says Rav Yehuda ben Beseira in our Mishnah. Now the Gemara goes into the types of materials that you can write a get on. Amar Rav Chia bar Asi Mishmei De'ula. Says Rav Chia bar Asi, the name of Ular, about 13 lines from the bottom, the two dots. Gimel Oyrais Hein. There are three types of hides with regard to Gittin. Matzah, Chifa, V'diftera. Rav Yehuda ben Beseira spoke about diftera, that's where this comes up. Matzah, what is matzah? Kimashmai. As matzah sounds, which is what? D'loi maliach, ud'loi kamiach, ud'loi off. It's like matzah. What's matzah? The matzah is quintessential, just bread and water. So when it comes to parchment, what's matzah? Paper. It's not maliach, it's not salted, lo kamiach, it's not floured, lo off. It says no walnuts on it. Very raw, we'll call it paper. So who cares? This type of paper, how much of this paper do you have to carry to be obligated for carrying on Shabbos? The amount of this paper to wrap up a small weight. Vikama, how much is that? A quarter of a papadisa, which Rashi says is a teeny little weight. That's if I have paper that's completely raw. The next type of paper is called chifa. That was a matzah. Now we have chifa, which is the maliach. It's salted, but it's not floured and it's not gold nuts. Lamay elchasa again. Shabbos. The halacha is regarding carrying. Vikama shirai. What's the share of this one? Kedetan. Or hides gilasas kemiya to make an amulet. And diftera, the final type of paper is diftera, which is what? Demaliach ukamiach is salted and floured, bavalei off it is no walnuts. Lamayel chasa, loisa Shabbos nachamol v'kamashiroi, tilich l'valav as I get. And that's where, of course, this comes in. The shiur over here is to write a get. This is what Rav Yehuda ben Beseira said. That's where the whole Gemara came from, which is diftera, which now we're learning is salted and floured paper, but it does not have walnuts on it, which of course is the chiddush, because then at some level it's ksav that's able to be forged, as we have seen. And the Rav Yehuda ben Beseira said it's a problem. V'chachamim hold it's kosher. Says the Gemara, man chachamim. Who are the chachamim? And Rashi says not just who are the chachamim. The question of the Gemara here is a little bit deeper. What is the reason? Man ninu umay taimayu demachshiri. Who are these chachamim that are saying it's kosher? Says the Gemara, Rav Elazar, Amar Rav Elazar. Says Rav Elazar, you know this is Rav Elazar. Rav Elazar says Rav Elazar is two different Rav Elazars, of course. One's a Tana, one's a Meira. So he says, who is this? This is the famous Rav Elazar who we have had already. What does Rav Elazar hold? Rav Elazar holds Eidem Mesira Karti, that which Eidem create the get. The Edim that create the get are the Edim that are seen as the Gittin being handed over, the Mesira, the handing over of the get. And at the top, Rashi points out that the Chasimas I get in a minat Torah. The Chasima is not the critical part. It's the handing over of the get. And similarly, we're not worried about what type of paper the get is written on as long as the Edim see the get given over. But V'amar Rav Elazar, and Rav Elazar qualifies this 2 lines down, Chav Beis and Mebeis. Lo yachshor Rav Elazar la'alter. When are we going to say with this type of paper, with Edim it's kosher? It's only right away. Avol mikan ad asar yamim loy. But after 10 days, this get is puzzle. Why? Maybe there was a condition in this get, and it was forged. We have Edim that witnessed the giving over of the get. They're not going to remember it. The whole point of writing things down on is to member it. But if the paper itself is not good paper, it's not going to be kosher. It's only going to be kosher for a get right away. For Rav Yochanan Amar, and hopefully Rav Yochanan should sound familiar. We had this back in your test. Says Rav Yochanan, Afilu mikana asara yam. And Rav Yochanan argues, no, it's kosher even after 10 days. Why? Because if there was a Tanai, he holds. It's true that we're forgetful people, but says Rav Yochanan, you would remember such a thing if there was a Tanai in a get. And finally, we conclude, V'amar Rav Elazar, Lo Hichser Rav Elazar ela Gittin. This din of Rav Elazar that we're having something that's kosher, it's only by get. Other shtaros written on this diphthera, written on this paper that could be erased, is not kosher. Why? They have to place it in a certain vessel, Laman Yom Duram, for many days. Laman Yom Duram for many days. So what do we see from over here? We see that it has to be something that could stand for many days, and a paper that could be forged does not qualify for that. Therefore, for other stars, it's going to be apostle. For Rav Yochanan Amar, and he argues again, afilu b'shtaros, even though the stars is going to be kosher. It says that the paper has to be able to stand. Rabbi Hasam Eitza Taiva Kamash says Rav Yochanan. That's just an Eitza Taiva. You're having a transaction, you're writing it down, you want to be able to have the proof of it. So therefore, but if you don't care, if you decide you want to do it, says Rav Yochanan, it'll be kosher even without that. We're going to stop over here, and we'll pick it up in the Mishnah the next year. B'siyata dishmaya.